Why? Ask how. Howard, is he going to shout this week? Is it time to turn the volume down? They're humongous! No, I don't feel like shouting. Okay, we'll go back to the humongous. All right. I know I look like a twit. But the fact is, we've been getting a lot of complaints from folks in the peanut gallery. I've challenged, I've attacked two real heavy-duty basic assumptions of science. One of them is the second law of thermodynamics, which is wholly in science. And I've said it's bullshit. The second is the concept known as stochasticity, known to us common folk as randomness. Another basic that's been lurking in the bowels of science since 1670, when the first book on probability and statistics was written. And the complaint we're getting is, how can this ridiculous human who shouts his name, the humongous, who looks like a cross between a clown and a wart, and who's worked with Michael Jackson, Prince, and Bob Marley, how can he possibly talk about these things in science? Doesn't that indicate that he is a scientific doofus? That he knows nothing about science? That he's scientifically illiterate? So let's do the story of how a lifetime scientific thinker gets into working with Michael Jackson, Bob Marley, and Prince. I'm going to put you in my shoes. You're 10 years old. You're living in this godforsaken steel town of Buffalo, New York. It is drab and it is dreary. There are very few people with a brain in Buffalo, New York. And even if there are many people with brains, somehow your brain doesn't mesh with their brains. And they do not like to have you around. Other kids only pay attention to you when they're using you as a hockey puck or a soccer ball, when they are kicking you around. You have no place in Buffalo, New York. No adults you can relate to, no kids you can relate to. And suddenly one day you're sitting in your great big living room. It's dark because your mom always keeps the curtains closed for God knows what reason, especially considering that there's a view of a park right out the window. It never occurs to anybody to open the drapes. And you know how when you're 10 years old, you know the location of every book your parents own, because they all stay in the same place on the shelves all the time, right? It's a Saturday afternoon, it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and suddenly a book appears in your hands you've never seen before. It doesn't have any place on the shelves. What's it doing in your house? You don't know. You can't remember, anyway. You open the book, and it says the following. It tells you the first two laws of science, the first two rules of science. Rule number one is the truth at any price, including the price of your life. Which means if you know something that's true and important, and people say, give it up, buddy, or we're going to slit your fucking throat, you have to say to them, screw you. What's true is true. And it gives the example of Galileo. But fortunately, it gives it all wrong. It makes Galileo look as if he were Giordano Bruno, a guy who actually did go to the stake and had a leather gag around his mouth so nobody could hear what he was saying while he was being burned alive in the Plaza of Flowers in Rome. I think it was Rome. Could have been Venice. Could have been Florence. They burned people alive in all kinds of strange places those days. But Galileo wasn't like Giordano Bruno. Galileo actually said, everything I've ever written is wrong. I swear it, honest, as long as I get to live. And they kept him under house arrest for 10 years instead of burning him at the stake. But it told you the story as if Galileo had had the courage of Giordano Bruno, and that's what you at the age of 10 need to hear, because you need a standard to measure yourself by. You need an example to live up to, and that example, told all wrong, told in a mythic way, thrills the hell out of you. Then it tells you the second law of science. Look at things right under your nose as if you've never seen them before, and then proceed from there. Look for the things that you and everybody else around you take for granted, and then proceed from there. Ask big questions of everything. Ask big questions of basic assumptions like entropy, basic assumptions like randomness. Look for basic assumptions other people don't see as questionable. Those are the most important ones to question. And these two rules grab you by the trachea. They grab you by the esophagus, and they rivet you for the rest of your life. And that's when you find a home among a bunch of people, the first playmates you've ever had, who can't possibly reject you. Why? Because most of them have been dead for 350 years. You have finally found your home, and you become utterly fascinated with microbiology and theoretical physics, cosmology, theories of the universe, and you begin to read 2 books a day of science fiction. You're a kid, and science under the desk. By the time you're 12 years old, you have begged your mom for the money to buy a kit that will allow you to build a Boolean algebra machine. Nobody in Buffalo has ever heard of Boolean algebra. What is it? It's a form of making logical statements in a way that a computer can understand. Guess where it's used today? In search engines like Google. When you put an "and" in between 2 things in great big letters, that's a Boolean statement. When you put an "or" in between 2 words to indicate one word or the other, that's a Boolean statement. You're using Boolean algebra. You just don't know it. So you build your first Boolean algebra machine at the age of 12. By then, of course, you've already bought a soldering gun, built your first transistor radio. It didn't work. Nothing you ever build works. The Boolean algebra machine works. You've gone and gotten a book of industrial formulae from the library, and you've made cold cream from scratch. You've tried to anneal metal in order to make your own copper wound cables in order to pull off all kinds of electrical tricks. But you've made a mistake. You've taken a bunch of wire hangers, which of course are coated with something, and you've burned them as much as you possibly can, bundling them together. Sorry, that's not how you anneal metal. At any rate, you've had some failures along the way, and you co-design with an older kid, a much older kid. You co-design a computer at the age of 12 that will play a game called Tactics. And guess what happens? It goes out and it wins several science fair prizes. You're not doing half bad. And then your mother, knowing that you've had very few friends, decides to take you someplace where you might get inspiration and be welcome. She takes you to see the head of the graduate physics department at the University of Buffalo, which is your local university. Now look, imagine what your mom must have gone through to get a 12-year-old a meeting with the head of not just the undergraduate physics department, the graduate physics department. This guy, he's probably had so much social pressure applied to him that it's a miracle he's not bleeding, that his eyeballs aren't busting out of his head. So you know he's probably agreed to meet with you for 2 minutes. You go into his office. Your mom is out in the waiting room reading magazines. Your mom has to make it through every magazine in the place. You don't come out for over an hour. Why? Because the hot topic when you're 12 in 1955 are 2 big theories of the beginning of the universe. One is called Big Bang Theory, which is brand new, highly controversial, and not by any means established. And the other one, which looks like it's on the verge of winning, which is called steady state theory. The idea that the universe is constantly producing new atoms and molecules, new hydrogen, new galaxies, new stuff. It's just always the same. It's always been the same. Actually, that's not quite accurate because there's a cyclical nature to Fred Hoyle's steady state universe, but we won't go into the complexities. So these things are raging like hell in the science community. People's lives are staked on them. People's careers are staked on them. And guess what you enjoy discussing more than anything else? Well, the implications of the Doppler shift and what it means for theories of the origin of the universe, Big Bang versus steady state. That's the hottest topic of the time. And the head of the graduate physics department has finally found somebody he can really go to town with on this. Even if it's a 12-year-old. That's you. That's you as a kid. And then at the age of 13, you suddenly realize you don't believe in God. You're an atheist. Well, if you're an atheist, how does a universe create itself? If there's no God saying, let there be light and darkness, how do we get light and darkness? If there's no God saying, let there be heavens and earth, how did we get heavens and earth? You realize, remember, the second law of science is look at things right under your nose as if you've never seen them before, and then proceed from there. The religionists are throwing you a challenge. If you don't want to account for this by using an intelligent designer, by the way, that phrase wasn't around at the time, or a God, you have to come up with an explanation within the framework of science. That is a basic job. But it makes you wonder when the high holidays, big things in Jewish life, parents who never go to a synagogue, who are not the least bit religious, will do everything in their power to drag their kids to the high holidays, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And the September, after you realize you're an atheist, your parents try to drag you to high holiday services, and you really don't want to go. So you hold on to the frame of the car with your hands like this while they grab you by the ankles and literally try to drag you up the street to the synagogue. And you realize something. There's an intensity to the passion with which they are trying to drag you. There is something deep inside them that clutches at this God for all it's worth. And you realize that one of the big things under your nose that you've never read any scientific explanation for at all is that God thing. That absolute need to believe in a God that is making your parents so passionate that they are willing to rip your socks and shoes off in order to drag you up the street. And all of a sudden you have a mission in life. It's to understand where the gods inside come from. You know something else. It's 1956. And Hitler and the Holocaust took place almost within your lifetime. And Hitler had this ability to summon a thing very much like a god. He'd get 250,000 people standing on the sidewalks of Berlin at 10 o'clock at night, watching soldiers march through the streets with torches lit. And he created a sensation so powerful that those 250,000 people on the sidewalks felt exalted out of themselves. You know how we all need something bigger than ourselves to work for? Something bigger than ourselves that gives our lives meaning? These people feel that they are suddenly touching that higher something that gives their lives meaning. It is the equivalent to a god. Of course, Hitler doesn't call it a god. He says it's ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer. One people. One Volk, ein Reich. One people, one state, and one leader. Of course, guess who the leader is? But it gets people into a state of exaltation. It gets them into a state of being in contact with the divine. There is something in common between that and what was driving your parents. And you want to know what it is. And you realize that no one you know in science is pursuing it. Despite all the books that you begin to pick up, William James on the varieties of the religious experience is the one you really take to the most. The second law of science says that if no one else is looking at this, it's your job to look at this. But how are you going to do it? You listen to Beethoven, Bartok, Stravinsky. Your friends are listening to rock and roll records. They don't want you. It's Elvis Presley. It's 1956. Elvis Presley has just become big the previous year. They're listening to Elvis. They're listening to pop music. They don't want you anywhere near their dances. They don't want you anywhere near their houses. They don't want you anywhere near where you could share your pop music with them. But you can stand next to a great big wooden radio with your uncle, and you can compete with him on who can name A classical piece of music the fastest, within the first note, hopefully. If not the first note, the very first bar. At least you have company in classical music. No one's going to let you into popular music. Not ever. Don't you realize you're a geek? You're a nerd. We fast forward a long time forward, and you've dropped out of school, you've dropped out of college, you've hitchhiked, and you've ridden the rails up and down the West Coast. You spent your life in science. At the age of 16, you worked at the world's largest cancer research facility, working on research on the immune system. During the course of that summer, at the world's largest cancer research center, you come up with a theory of the beginning, middle, and end of the universe that predicts that at one point, at a certain point, the universe will begin to accelerate away from itself. Something that won't be discovered. This is 1959. Something that won't be discovered for another 39 years. But the guys who discover it will win a bunch of Nobel Prizes. Your life has been spent in science, all of it. But you're on the track of a mystery, and you have grad school fellowships at 4 different grad schools. And all of a sudden you realize something. Grad school is Auschwitz for the mind. You are trying to get at the most essential passions in mass human groups, the gods within. Is giving paper and pencil tests to 22 college students going to get you anywhere near that kind of exaltation that hit the folks in the streets of Berlin when the torchlit parade was going through? Is it going to help you understand what so seizes your parents that they're willing to shred your socks to get you to a synagogue? You're not going to get anywhere near any of that. Not for the rest of your life. Meantime, you also are madly in love with poetry. You've been trying to write it ever since you were 13. Science is you, it's your core, but poetry is your fingers, your periphery. And the poet in residence at your school, NYU, tells you one day in class, when this class is over and everybody leaves, I want you to shut the door and stay inside with me. And when everybody leaves and you shut the door, he says, look, you little bastard, you little schmuck. Last year I asked you to be on the staff of the literary magazine, and you never showed up. This year I'm telling you, you are the literary magazine. You are the editor of the literary magazine. The minute you walk out this door, you're it. And you don't even have a faculty advisor. You're it. And you walk out of the room stunned because you hate literary magazines. They're these little blue things with terrible type that look turd-like, that could suck all the... You could have a room with 16 of the most lively people in the world. And if there's a literary magazine on a coffee table, wham! They'll all turn into zombies. Their energy will be gone, deflated, defeated. So you wonder what the hell you're going to do. And another student walks up to you and says, you look disturbed about something. Can I help you? And you explain, yes, I've just been named the editor of the literary magazine. And he says to you, well, why don't we go downstairs for a cup of coffee? Now remember, no kid ever wanted to have anything to do with you in Buffalo, New York. Your room was filled with laboratory rats and guinea pigs and books on science. Not to mention charts on the wall of the liftoff velocities for rockets in order to do something that hadn't been done yet. Get a satellite into orbit. And you have technical handbooks on how to build the rockets that will get satellites into orbit. So you don't know little ritual. I mean, mice and guinea pigs don't invite you for cups of coffee. You've never known. Nobody's ever invited you for a cup of coffee before. You really don't know what the ritual's all about. It makes you a little bit curious. Uncomfortable, but curious. So you go downstairs, and this person who's kind enough to care for you orders a cup of coffee, and you order a glass of water, and then he asks you eventually, after he finds out why you're so upset, he asks you one of the most important questions of your life. If you could do anything you want with this magazine, anything, what would it be? And you realize you could turn it into a picture book with poetry. And you do. You recruit a bunch of artists, and you turn out a magazine that so startles the people at NYU that after they see the first issue, they double your budget. No one ever gives you extra money, much less doubling your budget. It makes a huge splash. You get calls from the art directors at big magazines like Look, which is a huge picture magazine, and the Evergreen Review, which is the leading magazine for bohemian culture in North America, and Boys Life, which is the magazine for the Boy Scouts, and a group that you were thrown out of when you were 12 for incompetence at tying knots in Morse code. When you get all those fellowships, those graduate school fellowships, to go into what today is called neurobiology, then it was called physiological psychology, you don't want to go. You want to get out into the world where the wild things are, where the gods are, for God's sakes, where the real ecstasies and the real divinities are taking place. That's what you need to understand with all the disciplines that you've absorbed. The mathematics from Martin Gardner's mathematics section in the Scientific American, which you read from cover to cover from the time you were 11 years old. All the tricks that you've learned from evolutionary biology, from evolutionary psychology. I'm sorry, these things didn't exist yet. Let me get my words straight here. From cosmology, from microbiology. You had your first professional microscope when you were 11. Professional microscope. Zeiss Icon lenses. Real tricky thing to handle, but you handled it. You want to take all these tools and find the fucking gods. Inside individuals that make the gods inside of societies that make the wars that make history. You want to find the forces of history. You walk into it's your summer vacation. You're supposed to go to Columbia in September. You've insisted that if you accept Columbia, they will allow you to take courses in the med school and courses in psychology. Why? Because neurobiology as a field doesn't exist yet. That if you study both biology and psychology, you are hoping you will be able to study what will later be called neurobiology. They've said yes, which is unusual. And you're very uncomfortable about going. You walk into the home of one of the artists you've been working with on your magazine, and he's on the floor crying, his wife is on the floor crying, his baby, 2 years old, 3 years old, is on the floor crying. It's an empty room. There's no furniture, just a rug. A rug and a telephone, in the days when telephones were attached to walls with a long cord, and the long cord looks particularly naked on a floor without furniture. You've never seen 3 people crying before. And you ask them what is wrong. And your artist says, they're throwing us out of our apartment, they're cutting off our electricity, they're cutting off our telephone, we can't pay the bills. Well, this artist is brilliant. This artist is one of the most astonishing artists you have ever seen in your life. So you tell him, look, I'll take your portfolio out for 2 weeks, and I'll find you some work, and you won't have to leave your apartment. So he gets his portfolio together, along with a friend of his, or 2 or 3 friends, that he insists on bringing in with him. And you have a friend who's helped you develop the art side of the magazine, a photographer who's amazing, and a model maker who's amazing. Today he does robo porn, which, look it up. Look it up. If you can find it on YouTube, you'll be amazed. And you take the portfolio out. After 2 weeks, you haven't gotten any work. After 2 months, you haven't gotten any work. You don't like to leave projects unfinished. You're obsessive compulsive, you little bastard. You can't stand to leave an unfinished project behind. And you've had a wife. You got married in your freshman year of college to a woman with a 5-year-old child. And she's basically giving you the message that her first husband was a student. You've been a student for the last 3 years. She doesn't want student husbands anymore, which means if you stay a student, she doesn't want you. So you take the combination of all these forces and you call Columbia and you say, I have a problem. I won't be able to come this year. I'll come next year. And they're kind enough to say, okay. And you continue to work with the portfolio of the artists. Well, eventually you make it on the cover of Art Direction magazine. Eventually you end up doing all the advertising graphics for ABC's 7 FM stations at a time when FM radio is going through a radical change from top 40 to something called progressive rock. It's a whole new movement, and you're part of making it. You're part of making it. And that brings you a little bit into the rock and roll industry. You invent a new animation technique for NBC TV, and you work for a publication called The Institutional Investor, which gives you an insight into the investment and finance world. And then you get your art studio a real prize. there's a new magazine being formed. It's based on a magazine that comes out of Harvard once a year. And it's going to be national. It's going to come out monthly. It's a humor magazine. It's called The National Lampoon. And you land that for your artists. They are now the art directors of the National Lampoon. And one of the artists says, if Howard is here, he always keeps me from taking over projects. Because it's an artist who does substandard work, to tell you the truth. I couldn't stand his work. I did keep him away from projects because the people I was selling the artwork to didn't want him. They wanted other people. But if I get Howard kicked out of the studio, not only will he have this giant check that's coming in every month, we won't have to give him his share, and I'll be able to take over the project. And he does, and he ruins the first 7 issues of the National Lampoon. Take a look at them sometime. They're a mess. You are thrown out of your art studio. Is this a tragedy, or is it an opportunity? It's an opportunity. But you've been obsessed with writing. That's another story. Should I tell this story? All right, I'm going to subject you to this story. When you're 12 years old and you're in 8th grade, you have a big realization one day. No one ever looks you in the eye. When people see you, they look away from you, and you take that for granted. So it never occurs to you that there's any other state of things. Until one day, a girl in class, who you think particularly hates you, turns her eyes in your direction and actually makes eye contact. And that's the first time you realize there is such a thing as eye contact with other kids. The kids have been calling you the sickly scientist since you were 11 years old. And she says, I told my mother that you understand the theory of relativity. This creates a problem for you. Remember the first law of science, the truth at any price, including the price of your life. And you have a little problem here, you little bastard. You don't know the theory of relativity, but you keep your mouth shut. And as soon as school gets out, you jump on your bicycle and you go to the library where the librarians know you better than your mother knows you. And you say, give me everything you got on the theory of relativity. And they throw 2 books at you, a great big fat one by Albert Einstein and 2 collaborators, and a little skinny one by just Albert Einstein. You've come to know that if you apply yourself to something you don't seem to understand in the least, and you really stick with it no matter what, you end up understanding something. It could take 8 hours, 16 hours, 24 hours, but you'll end up understanding something. The fat book you start with first, and it's got nothing but equations on the page. A couple of words of English at the top, a couple of words of English at the bottom, and the rest is equations. And guess what? You and equations have never gotten along. Not at all. You work at it from 3:30 in the afternoon until 8 o'clock at night. And you've gotten 50 pages into it. Then you have a problem. You realize you're not going to understand the theory of relativity the next morning if you stick with this book. It's hard for you to do this, but you kick yourself out of this book. Remember, you're obsessive compulsive. And you move to the little one. And the little one's by Einstein on his own. Have you ever had that feeling that a writer has left a message in a bottle for you? That a writer of a book is reaching out through the pages and grabbing you by the lapel and giving you a message? Well, in the introduction to the Little Blue Book, it felt as if Albert Einstein, by the way, he was still alive at the time. I would never meet him. It felt as if Albert Einstein was grabbing me by the lapels and saying, schmuck. A word that was used a lot in my presence in those days. He's saying to you this: to be a genius, it is not enough to come up with a theory that only 7 men in the world can understand, which was Einstein's reputation at the time. To be a genius, you have to be able to come up with that theory and then express it so clearly and so compellingly that anyone with a high school education and a reasonable degree of intelligence can understand it. In other words, Albert Einstein, when you're 12 years old, has told you if you seriously want to be a scientific thinker, you must learn to write. And you must not only learn to write, you must learn to write deliciously. So what you really want to do as your next phase as a scientific thinker when they throw you out of the art studio is to start publishing articles in magazines so you can become a clear, delicious writer. And guess what? Several magazines have got you on their masthead as a contributing editor. You've been working from 6 o'clock in the morning until 8:30 in the morning at your typewriter, contributing to some of the magazines whose offices you walked into while you were carrying your portfolio for your artists. And then you've been coming home, and from 8 o'clock at night until 11 o'clock at night you've been writing. Well, one day you're covering a parapsychology convention for one of the magazines. It's called Natural Lifestyles. And a kid walks up to you and says, "Would you like to edit a magazine?" And you think, that would be heaven. I've been getting up at 6:30 in the morning and going to the typewriter. Then I've been working until 11:30 at night and going to sleep. If I edited a magazine, I could do this from 9 to 5. And I wouldn't have to get up at 5:30 or 6 o'clock in the morning. Sounds wonderful. You don't bother to ask what it's about. You just don't bother. You assume that if you do your research and care about your audience, if you really love your audience, if you have empathy, if you can put yourself in their shoes, that you can write about anything. And it turns out to be a magazine about rock and roll. That's how you, a science junkie who has science in his bones, who has science in his fingernails and the tissues of his muscles, that's how you get into the world of rock and roll. And eventually you start the biggest PR firm in the music industry. And you work with Prince, Michael Jackson, Bob Marley, Bette Midler, AC/DC, Aerosmith, Kiss, Queen, Run DMC, Billy Joel, Billy Idol, Paul Simon, Peter Gabriel, and a whole lot more. But it's a science expedition for you. It's an expedition into the forces of history. It's an expedition to the mass passions that Hitler evoked to change the face of history, almost for really the worst. It's an expedition into the part of the heart where the gods are. It's an expedition into whatever it was that dragged your parents into dragging you. And when you get out of it, you are invited to address an international conference of quantum physicists in Moscow about why everything they know about quantum physics is wrong. The Office of the Secretary of Defense throws a forum based on one of your books and brings in people from the State Department, the Energy Department, DARPA, IBM, and MIT. Your scientific work is published in Arxiv.org, the leading preprint site for advanced theoretical physics and mathematics. It's printed in New Ideas in Psychology, radically different field. It's printed in Across Species Comparisons on Psychopathology. And it is printed, your work shows up in Physica Plus, a physics magazine. You're taken seriously in the territory you started with when you were 10 years old. Science. Why? Because your entire life has been devoted to science. Because those 20 years you spent exploring popular culture were a scientific expedition. You didn't belong there any more than you had belonged with the kids in Buffalo throwing parties in their backyards who put sentries on the driveways to keep you from even coming up the driveway. You didn't belong there, but you used the tools of your science, the tricks from Martin Gardner's mathematical game section of the Scientific American, to succeed where the people who were a part of that culture didn't know how to succeed. You've done everything you've done in life because of one thing, science. So you are above all things, whatever you want to call it, a scientific thinker, a scientist. One way or the other, your obligations are these: the truth at any price, including the price of your life. And look at things like entropy and randomness that other people take for granted, as if you have never seen them before. Look, in fact, for other basic assumptions that even I am blind to, and challenge them, because those are the obligations of science, and you are science incarnate. This is Howard the Humongous, speaking to you from the future, that it is your job and mine to make.